My name is John Seidel. I'm director of Washington College's Center for Environment and Society, and it's a really great pleasure to welcome you to the 5th annual Chesapeake Semester Forum. So I can't believe we've been doing this for 5 years. 5 years ago, this was a big experiment. We were pretty sure it would work, but we weren't positive. And the Chesapeake Semester, for those of you who are not that familiar with it, really emerged out of a sense of both opportunity and frustration. The opportunity was, of course, that we got this wonderful estuary out our back door, this incredible river, incredible farmland, great people and resources, and it's perfect for the interdisciplinary study of some of the really pressing environmental issues facing our country. The frustration, however, was that every time we tried to go out into the field with students, we had to get them back for their next class, or we had to get them back for athletic practice, or whatever it might happen to be that was next on the calendar. So what we conceived of was a program in which the students would be all hours, essentially, for the entire semester. Sort of a study abroad, but right here at home, where we would tell students that if they wanted to do this, it required a commitment, and it required a willingness to essentially give up both your social life as well as many of those extracurricular activities for a full semester. In return, what we promised was 16 credits of an interdisciplinary study of the Chesapeake Bay, drawing on as many of the disciplines here at Washington College as we possibly could, because we firmly believe that that approach is the approach that's going to help us come to some solutions for many of these pressing problems. So the way the thing has been organized, I think you can see up on the screen here, it involves an immense amount of time out in the field. Essentially, the model is very simply about 2 weeks in the classroom studying a set of issues or a set of topics, and then moving off campus to explore these things in the field, to meet the people, to see the places, to really try and get a grasp on it from an experiential sensory level, and not shy away from complexity, not shy away from hot topics, but really to explore them as fully as we possibly could. Ultimately, what we end up doing is spending about 46 days on the road. So it was 46 days you guys were in the field this semester, seeing all of these people and seeing all of these places. And today, in a sense, is the culmination. So before we start, I want to personally thank a number of people, and I'm not going to go through the whole list because it would take the next half hour. So many people were involved, and I know Mike Hardesty also wants to thank people. But we had 55 partners with whom we met over the course of the past semester, many of whom are here, many others would like to be here and simply couldn't because of time or distance. In addition, there were 24 faculty and staff from Washington College and also from our partner, the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum, who are with us in this endeavor. That's an enormous amount of faculty for 4 courses, but I think it helps enrich the program enormously. And I guess finally, I want to thank the students. You guys are what makes it worthwhile. For those of you who are parents or relatives out there, thank you so much for letting us take over their lives for the past 3 months. We gained an enormous amount out of it, and I hope they did as well. And I think you're going to be very, very excited and pleased by what you see this afternoon. Mike Hardesty is the assistant director for the Chesapeake Semester, and Mike is going to lay out for us exactly what we're going to do. Mike?
Welcome, and thank you, John. Thank you for joining us for our 2013 Chesapeake Semester Final Project Forum. It's always wonderful to see so many familiar faces, faculty of Washington College here, community partners from the local area, and it's wonderful to see new faces as well, friends and families of our students. My name is Mike Hardesty, and I'm the assistant director for the Chesapeake Semester. This program, as John said, is a far cry from being the effort of one person or even a few people. 24 says a lot. But I would like to spend just a moment thanking people that I think have been really critical to implementing and hosting the Chesapeake Semester. First, Ben Ford, now a fixture at the Center for Environment and Society, runs all of the program's logistics. We wouldn't have a place to sleep. We probably wouldn't have any food to eat, and we wouldn't have someone to laugh with, at, around, about as well. Kathy Thornton Chesapeake Semester graduate in 2010, now working for the Center for Environment and Society as our events coordinator and outreach planner, is responsible for all of our promotion and is largely responsible for the details of today's events. So I wanted to thank her personally. I'd like to say thank you to John, the director of the Center for Environment and Society, for getting this thing kicked off 5 years ago. It was a dream then. It's still a little bit of a dream now, only because it's amazing and it's a fantastic thing to be a part of. I want to thank our deputy director, Doug Levin. Doug, where are you? There he is in the back. He's instrumental to keeping this program running, both as a course instructor and as a mentor at large. I would also like to say thank you to our Chesapeake Semester faculty. As John said, we have 24 partners on this, including our partners at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum, and it's an incredible and tremendous turnout, and to have them participate in this team-taught class, really want to focus on team-taught, is remarkable and unique. And this year we had, we worked with them in a number of capacities, ranging from classroom lectures to campfire stories to boat restorations on Deal Island. And we had a great distribution and even distribution across all of the disciplines of the natural sciences, social sciences, and humanities represented in our team-taught class. But they only make up part of the curriculum. The rest of the curriculum is provided for by our community partners, and I'd like to say thank you to all of them. They invite us into their office, they invite us onto their boats, their farms, and they often host us with their families. We would not be able to provide such a great out-of-the-classroom learning experience without the willingness and desire of our neighbors to host us and teach us. And it really is a wonderful team-taught experience. However, this year, and perhaps more than other years past, and I know there's previous Chesapeake Semester students in this room, but there was an incredible synergy this year with our 2013 Chesapeake Semester class, and I really honed in on not just the team teaching uniqueness of the Chesapeake Semester, but the team learning. It was really outstanding for me this year. I've had the privilege to work with, teach, laugh, eat, travel, swim, fish, play, eat again, supervise, organize, console, guide, and learn from such an engaging, dedicated, hardworking group of students. There is a real skill in team learning. One must be patient, respectful, and trusting. One must be responsive and responsible. One can't simply rely on oneself to figure things out, and that's really the easy way out. Instead, delegation, cooperation become the tools you need to move forward. And if you do it right, and you learn how to work well with your peers and colleagues and professors, you can truly create something greater, learn more, do more, see more. Today, you will see 2 research documentaries presented by 2 student groups. These documentaries are only part of the students' final project. Following the documentaries, we'll host a panel discussion and around the documentaries and around the students' larger experience through the semester. By Friday the 13th, I just want to say that again, by Friday the 13th, students will have submitted their research paper on Friday the 13th. We picked that date deliberately, which I just think is great. And the research paper will expound upon the research documentary we're seeing today in greater detail. Today, you will not see everything that we have learned and experienced. 3 hours just isn't enough. But you can read the student blogs found on our CES website to learn more, and you can talk with our newly minted Chesapeake Semester ambassadors to find out even more from there. These documentaries are the results of the blood, sweat, and tears of our dear students, and not over the course of the last 4 months, but over the course of the last few weeks, really, and let's be honest, over the last few days, 48 hours, crunch. But that's not by accident. We cover 2,300 miles around the Chesapeake Bay and fly 3,600 miles to Peru for 15 days so that we can explore and learn everything that we possibly can as a team. To then turn around, distill, create, and communicate some of the complex issues that we have confronted as a class in such a short time is no easy task. And over the past week, I have seen some great teamwork and some great team learning. Okay, so we gave our students the option to pick from a variety of guiding topics. Guiding topics is our jargon, which they're very familiar with. But for purposes of us here today, our guiding topics are single words that are loaded, okay? And from that word, we expected the students to explore a controversy and research that controversy inspired by that word. They should then teach us, in a compelling format through video, what they've learned. Similar to the Chesapeake, we're not looking for answers or solutions. These controversies can be extremely complex, and some are even timeless, before us and will probably last after us. But we can learn, and we can be thoughtful, and we can work towards progress, a multifold, dynamic, committed definition of solution. Our first group tackled the topic of access. Access was their word. So they're known lovingly as the Access Group. And I'll just read the title of their documentary. The description's found in your program. They're going to be able to speak on it better than I. But they took read the title. Menhaden Management. What's the next step? They took access, that concept of access, and figured out a tremendously contentious issue within the Chesapeake, particularly around the Menhaden fish, and directly paralleled it to and compared it to another very large fishery that we don't know about, but that we discovered in Peru and will learn more about today. That was Doug's creation. Our second group tackled the topic of islands. Islands. I presented that one word and said, run with it. Based on your experience in the Chesapeake semester, what controversy, what thoughts come out under this word of islands? And I'll admit that idea grew organically from the students themselves and our faculty. They kind of developed that topic in and of themselves, which was really nice to see. The title of their documentary is Where Are the Islands? A comparative study of island communities. Similarly, this group took the opportunity to share with us their time in Peru around what wouldn't actually seem to be on first glance an island. There aren't many islands at 14,000 feet in the middle of the Andes, but we kind of found one. And the students spent a great job comparing it right back to something near and dear to us, the islands of the Chesapeake, specifically Deal Island. And I think you'll be very, very impressed with this comparison. And with that, and without further ado, I want the students to speak on it more than me. I'll ramble forever. Please save your questions for the documentaries until they're all finished. We will transition into a panel discussion where our faculty for the Chesapeake semester will come forward, and our students will come forward, and we'll have a nice discussion, and we'll invite the audience to participate. The videos will all be found on our CES website and Washington College YouTube, so we will have copies of them out there. And there will be a small break after the documentaries are viewed. So without further ado, access, team access. Come to the front.
Hello, everyone. I'm Becca Potachny. On behalf of my colleagues Kelly Rogers, Anna Young, and Riley O'Brien, we would like to welcome you to the Chesapeake Semester Final Project Forum. Thank you all for coming. Our documentary, titled Menhaden Management, What's the Next Step?, follows our group as we spoke with fishermen, businessmen, regulators, and scientists about the monumental regulation that was recently implanted to manage the Menhaden fishery along the Atlantic, and most notably the Chesapeake Bay. Through our research, we found many uncertainties regarding the controversial regulation, and despite the universal recognition that the Atlantic menhaden are a highly valued fish, we found little agreement as to why, which only conflated the ways and how we would value them in the future. My colleagues and I decided to look elsewhere for management techniques. In our travels through our Peruvian comparative study, we found stark similarities and notable differences to the Peruvian anchovy fishery and its management of a keystone forage fish similar to our own Atlantic menhaden. While the cultures associated with the fisheries are definitely different, the issues they are attempting to manage are not. In our documentary, we explore some ways in which we can learn from our colleagues from the South. Our group had a great time in gathering all the interviews and information. Receiving a tour through the Omega protein plant in Reedville, Virginia was one of the highlights of this trip. In hindsight, the group wishes that we could have experienced firsthand a menhaden catch, but we are satisfied and very excited to share with you our research documentary. Our group extends a thanks to everyone who has assisted us in compiling our finished documentary, and we hope you enjoy. Thank you. Brian, if you could come up here, that would be great. Okay, I just know where it was.
That's right. Thank Ryan Palmer. Director of Digital Media Services here at Washington College and Mastermind. He equipped us with all of the necessary equipment.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, you're right. I had to grab the hard drive. Thanks.
Yep.
In order to capture all this information, and he also directed our students. Now he's gone. There he is, Brian.
For some reason, I was thinking we're switching the order.
Menhaden fishery in the Chesapeake Bay?
Nothing.
Yeah, I've lived here all my life. I don't know nothing about it.
No, I don't even know what it is.
Never even heard of that.
I know some people commercial, that's their only way of, feeding their family, their only means.
I don't know too much about that.
Menhaden fishery, well, I mean, I know that commercial fishermen go out and fish for it now in order to supply for bait boxes for local watermen, and I know that pretty much everything eats it. It's a pretty essential bait fish.
The Atlantic menhaden, Brevortia tyrannus, is a small migratory fish found along the east coast from Nova Scotia to Florida. These forage fish are a keystone species and are essential to the health of the ecosystem, as they are a food source for predatory fish and seabirds. Menhaden are known to travel in schools ranging from hundreds of thousands to millions and spawn in the shelf water of the Chesapeake Bay. In the mid-1950s, there were 150 vessels harvesting menhaden along the Atlantic. Today, there are only 7 vessels harvesting menhaden for one reduction facility in Reedville, Virginia, Omega Protein. This plant processes menhaden into fish meal and fish oil products that are used in pet food, fertilizer, cosmetics, and dietary supplements. Although we do not consume these fish directly, they are used to feed products that we do consume, such as farm-raised salmon, poultry, and pork. The menhaden fishery has come into a narrow media spotlight recently due to controversy between the commercial fishing industry and regulatory organizations who worry that the population has declined to detrimental levels. Conservationists claim that the reduction in harvest is critical to bring back the menhaden population to its former abundance. In this film, we directed our efforts towards studying the various impacts of the new regulation. We spoke with those most affected by the reduction and discovered the uncertainties within the fishery threshold model. Because of these uncertainties, we decided to explore other management techniques. While traveling in Peru, we studied the efforts used in managing the Peruvian anchoveta and have considered what effect implementing their strategies would have on the Chesapeake Bay. With so much focus on the organisms in the Chesapeake Bay, like crabs, oysters, and rockfish, it is easy to overlook a resource that is not used for human consumption. What folks do not realize is that without this keystone species, other populations like the rockfish would decline. While they might not feel direct impacts of the declining Menhaden population, the public will surely feel economic impacts on the cost of seafood in years to come. Restoring the valuable Menhaden will in return sustain our highly treasured Chesapeake Bay ecosystem. We are presenting the controversy and issues around the Atlantic Menhaden to inform people about what is going on with the fishery. As with many environmental issues, there are also strong biases. After reading the most recent stock assessment reports, we found that the data began to contradict itself. Upon seeing how little the community knows about Menhaden, we decided to explore the Menhaden fishery for ourselves in hopes of finding the truth. So, we headed down to Reedville, Virginia to visit the last remaining Menhaden processing plant on the East Coast, Omega Protein Incorporated. Before our grand tour of Omega Protein's plant, we found Cockerel's, a seafood restaurant owned by Linda Jett. Linda and Mike Vlahovic, a former Reedville resident, explained the impact Omega Protein has on the local economy.
If Omega was to ever shut down, the economy here would go bad.
Well, our property butted up against the Menhaden plant. So I heard it all the time, I smelled it all the times. You just lived in this brown haze from the Menhaden plant. But you didn't dare complain because they would make it clear to you that that was the smell of money, and that's what fueled the town.
Once we arrived at Omega Protein, we were greeted by Monty Deal, the Senior Director of Fishing Operations. He shared with us his views regarding the 20% reduction. We were catching yearly about 550 million fish. However, when we got this 20% reduction, it cut us to about 427 million, so that is what our quota is today. We were then given a tour of the processing plant by William Purcell, the environmental manager of the Reedville Omega Protein facility. One of the most controversial names in the Menhaden contention is Omega Protein, a fish reduction company. This commercial industry uses spotter planes to locate large schools of Menhaden. Spotter pilots are trained to estimate the size of a school and communicate with the boat below, guiding them towards the school, therefore maximizing efficiency. Once ordered, the large vessel sends out 2 smaller purse boats to surround the school or a section of the school with a purse seine net. After creating a complete circle around the school, the larger vessel can then begin to pull in the net, creating an underwater purse filled with millions of fish. These fish are then pumped onto the boat using a fish vacuum. After the vessel reaches its holding capacity, it then heads into port to unload its catch.
As Monty mentioned, we are the economic engine for this rural area, this 4-county area.
The Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, that manages all the Atlantic fisheries, placed a limit on the Menhaden fishery, and because of this monumental regulation, we decided to take a closer look at the way federal agencies, like the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, determine the most ideal percentage of reduction.
There's consensus that we're overfishing, but it's uncertain by how much. We know we need to end overfishing, but we don't exactly know what percent of reduction in harvest will get us there immediately.
How can we know whether or not it's overcatch until we really control that catch?
We were introduced to the fishery threshold models and stock assessments, which hold much controversy due to discrepancies in data collection.
You report landings in the fishery. That means you report where the fish were landed, not necessarily give you a whole lot of information about where they were caught. That would be, left to the fishermen to know about that.
Essentially, the only people that produce data for their model is omega protein.
Probably one of the big core issues here with Menhaden is the concern that, yes, it's a single species that's fished for bait and for the reduction fishery, but it's also important forage fish for a lot of other things.
Understanding that the bait fishery is also an important aspect of the Menhaden catch, we wanted to speak with a pound net fisherman located on the Chester River. Unlike Virginia, purse seine nets have been banned in Maryland since 1931. Therefore, pound net fishing is the only efficient way to catch menhaden in the Maryland waters of the Chesapeake Bay. Impacts of the declining Atlantic menhaden population are felt along the entire East Coast. Unlike many conservationists, watermen are not blaming omega protein for the decline.
The numbers were down this year because I think of the rainfall all up and down the bay. Now, last year it would have hurt them a lot because they rely on it. They catch, they come in with 200-300 bushel. Problem with that is, like this year, later in the year, and we had a lot of menhaden in here, especially down the river farther. In the mornings, the whole river was completely covered with them on top, but the nets would catch zero because certain times of the year they just will not trap in a pound net. In nature, you have rabbits. So everything eats a rabbit. And it's like same thing out here. Everything eats menhaden. It's one of the best baits you can have for catfish, and there's no shortage of catfish. So the catfish are eating them. There's a lot of stuff that's after.
After assessing the various viewpoints from each of the stakeholders in the menhaden fishery, it appears that there is little trust in the current management practices involving the menhaden. There are significant uncertainties revolving around the effectiveness of the 20% reduction. Even with the lack of sufficient data, the Atlantic States Marine Fishery Commission recognized the need to create a temporary solution. Thus, the 20% reduction was implemented. If the current reduction proves to be effective in restoring menhaden populations when assessed in 2014, we anticipate that commercial fisheries like omega protein would need to adapt to a smaller catch limit in order to stay in business. But how? As part of the Chesapeake Semester curriculum, we traveled to Peru to learn more about the country's rich culture and ecosystems, and were introduced to a fishery very similar to our Atlantic menhaden. The Peruvian anchoveta, Angralis ringens, is a small forage fish that lives in the waters of the Humboldt upwelling, a cold water current off the coast of South America. The anchoveta thrives in abundance because of the ideal conditions offered by the nutrient-rich waters of the Humboldt current. As an important member of the ecosystem like the menhaden, anchoveta serve as a food source for predatory fish and seabirds. By 1970, the anchoveta were harvested in astounding numbers, over 12 million metric tons, with the average anchoveta weighing a quarter of a pound at most. Due to severe overfishing, the annual harvest is now only 8 million metric tons. However, the anchoveta fishery has remained the largest single-species fishery in the world. The fish meal and fish oil that are the products of this reduction fishery are in high demand within the country of Peru. These products also make their way onto the shelves of stores around the globe, including the United States.
Fish oil country of origin is Peru. Product of Peru. That's 3 out of the 4.
The reduction fishery in Peru has been depleted, much like that of the Atlantic menhaden, but the management approach is very different. El Centro para la Sostenibilidad Ambiental is an important environmental organization focused on the sustainable development of Peru. They have recognized the importance of anchoveta to the Peruvian ecosystem and have taken it upon themselves to help the fish by changing its social stigma. Instead of taking a regulatory approach to manage the fishery by way of restriction, CSA drove a movement to transition from fish meal to fish meals. CSA created a partnership with a top chef, a biologist, and a graphic designer in order to tackle this issue. With their unique viewpoints, they were able to devise a plan to reawaken the cultural connections to anchoveta in order to decrease harvest.
Using fish for human consumption, we can provide twice as much income and 4 times as much employment as what we do now, which is mainly using the most important fishery on earth to produce fish meal and oil to feed animals around the world.
If the anchoveta is processed for direct human consumption, the fish has greater added value, which allows for low catches while maintaining economic stability. Can the Chesapeake Bay region follow in Peru's footsteps and transition Menhaden into a product for direct human consumption? Would you eat a Menhaden?
Oh, no. That's going to be a tough sell.
If no one will eat the Menhaden directly, how else can we balance ecology and economy in the Chesapeake Bay region? We considered an approach similar to CSA's. In the Chesapeake Bay, we should increase the market demand for human consumption of a fish oil as a dietary supplement. If the reduction of the catch limit proves to be beneficial to the health of the fishery, this transition towards human-consumed oil would not only allow for the growth of the economy, but would also contribute to the preservation of the species. The management techniques of Peru and prospectively of the Chesapeake Bay are both based on a revolutionary change in the way a species of fish is used. CSA has taken steps towards a specific market because there is potential for direct consumption. Although Atlantic Menhaden has a much lower potential in this regard, we can take aspects of CSA's progressive reformation of the industry. We can learn from Peru as we move forward into the environmental reform surrounding the industry in the Bay, and therefore anticipate similar changes that might have negative impacts on the ecosystem. When human beings begin to deplete a resource like Menhaden or anchoveta, we are obligated to alter the way we view the supply. In the Chesapeake Bay, making a reduction like the 20% cut is a clear manifestation of an effort to reduce human impact on naturally occurring species. It is uncertain if the change in the annual catch limit will truly benefit the fishery, but regardless of if it does or not, there can still be hope for this small but mighty forage fish, the Atlantic Menhaden.
Oh, my sweet heaven on the Chesapeake. My sweet heaven on the Chesapeake, you should hear the wild geese call. For it's there men work upon the water, tonging for the oyster, nowhere men were caught. My sweet heaven on the Chester, all year long we're singing heaven, 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 heaven on the old Chester.
Sorry to cut that one off. We've got Andrew right here. We just get him to come up and finish it. Did you guys play a little music when you met with Andrew? Oh, that's great.
Try to get the video with some B-roll in there.
A little jam session?
Yeah.
That's good. That's great. Why don't you stand up, take a bow for the audience? We've got our access group, Riley O'Brien, Becca Patachny, Anna Young, Kelly Rogers. Well done, guys. Well done. I would like to welcome next, fondly known as the Island Group. Our representative today will be Trish Petty. Please join us to the front. I hope you don't need any of my help. That's that part.
Probably.
afternoon. I'm Trish Petty. My team is Kelly Dabrowski, Madhu Cornelius, Tori Oppal, and I would like to thank you all for joining us today. Our documentary entitled, Where Are the Islands? A comparative study of island communities challenges the stereotypical definition of an island. It is more than merely a landmass surrounded by water. Throughout our semester, we have analyzed contrasting environments, cultures, foods, and economies, and we begin with the islands right here in the Chesapeake. We then travel 3,600 miles, climbed 14,000 feet above sea level, and landed in the remote heart of the Peruvian Andes Mountains, where surprisingly we discovered a place seemingly as remote, as culturally rich, and as ecologically unique as our own islands here in the Chesapeake. While the community we explored, known as Parque de la Papa, or Potato Park, is obviously not your typical island, we found a compelling story of similarities and differences between the two communities. Each confronted their own challenges and presented their own adaptations. Throughout this process, we discovered the unique intricacies of each island communities and how their isolated cultures, economy, resources, vulnerability to collapse affects every part of their island. While we offer no answers to what island communities confront, we have found that these communities can and should learn from one another. It is our hope that our research documentary will highlight some of these opportunities. Please enjoy, and we look forward to discussion afterwards. Brian. It might be.
Throughout the Chesapeake semester, we were confronted with many issues such as population growth, climate change, land erosion, pollution, and sedimentation. We also delved into the topic of island communities, which sparked our interest and became the basis of our research. But in order to begin, we must discover what an island community is.
What is an island? I'd have to say an island is a landmass that's surrounded by a body of water that you would need non-land transportation devices to move goods to and from that area.
Something that's isolated. It could be a landmass that forms in a body of water, gets separated from a larger landmass. If we're talking about people or society, it could be a group that's isolated from another group.
People tend to think of islands as things that are surrounded by water, but all they need to be, really, biologically, is isolated from other places.
My definition of an island would be any community that either chooses to separate itself from surrounding communities or is isolated by physical barriers.
You have physical islands, but then you have communities that are islands as well, because they've been sort of cut off, whether by their physical location or, their distance from other communities.
Deal Island, like many islands in the Chesapeake Bay, is connected to the mainland by a land bridge. This allows for easier and quicker access to and from the mainland. This island supports an incredibly unique community, which is centered around the waterman culture. In order to fully understand the culture and resources of the area of an isolated community, we asked several citizens throughout the island their opinions.
Everybody's friendly and nice, and we're pretty close knit.
We don't have a grocery store, or not the nearest fun stuff is 45 minutes away, but it's a good isolated to us. If I had to take a boat to get to and from everywhere I needed to go, I would definitely move away. That would be too rough for me.
Culture can be defined as the characteristics of an individual community, such as the waterman culture of Deal Island. Here they focus on harvesting oysters, as this is the most productive fishery around the island.
I've been here my whole life, just about. I just didn't care for being over on the Western Shore. It was too fast a life, you know. It was just rush, rush, rush everything you did.
I just work on boats. So that's what I like to do. There's nothing to do here if you don't work on the water.
Some don't want to work on the water, and then there's not really a lot of job opportunities close by. So that's one of the main reasons people do move away. They want to work somewhere like in the city where they pay more jobs.
I hear where watermen are coming from when they say they feel like they're a dying breed.
It's about 50-50 now. People that work in town or away on the road or whatever. So the other 50 would have to find something else to do also, I guess. As it is right now, it's going great, but that can all change overnight because it's all up to nature to supply us with the oysters.
The younger population is leaving because you can't get any jobs, which I did. I left and went to work, and I had a good job, but I just didn't care for it that much. But most of the younger people have to leave to get a good job. It's the biggest problem we got. But when I was young, almost everybody worked on the water. Now it's only probably about 10% work on the water that's living here. They try to get a good education.
It's a dying life. It's just the way it is all over the region.
Watermen of this area struggle to survive with the low number of bushels they are permitted to harvest per day and the low price per bushel. With all of these regulations, along with high license fees, the next generation may not be able to continue with this career.
When I oystered, the oyster license were $50. Now they're like $1,000 or something.
I don't think it'd be any such thing as a waterman in another 20 years, if you want to be truthful with you. I think it'll be an endangered species. They're already endangered species, but I think in another 20 years there won't be any watermen. It's not because it won't be oysters and crabs, it's just because you can't afford to do it. Because everything you do costs so much and the product don't go up hardly any at all.
I think the most challenging thing about working as a waterman, working in the wild fishery, is the fact that you are really at the whims of Mother Nature. And you're at the whims of the people in the watershed who are impacting the water quality. That's a hard way to make a living. It's a hard way to make a living knowing that you've got really no control over the fact that if you have a really, really intense storm system in the spring, it might wash all the baby crabs, the zoea, out of the Chesapeake Bay. And so are you going to even have any crabs to catch that season? With oystering, I mean, you might have another strong storm system and it upsets the salinity of the bay and you've got a major oyster moratorium. You know, it's no longer, I think, a reliable way to make a good living. I would encourage someone to go to college and get a job in something they know is steady. And working in the Chesapeake Bay is anything but that now.
We took these issues we had researched within the Chesapeake with us as we traveled to Peru. Parque de la Papa, an area located in the highlands of the Andes, is disconnected by dirt roads, poor infrastructure, dispersed school and healthcare systems. Similar to the island communities of the Chesapeake, Parque de la Papa's remoteness has resulted in sustaining an area steeped in local traditions. At the same time, the area of Parque de la Papa faces many of the same challenges we witnessed in island communities of the Chesapeake. They are facing a lack of job diversity, little entertainment for youth, and a lack of economic mobility, resulting in a high level of emigration, particularly youth, for employment and education opportunities.
So, to sum up some of the problems facing Quechua communities, one of those is threats to their crops, threats to their livelihood through climate change. So whether it is increased temperatures and different zones now in which crops have to be grown, whether it is shortages of water, their basic livelihood is at risk. Second is the lure of the outside world. It's a very, very powerful and seductive thing.
Despite the challenges the area faces, Parque de la Papa is actually a close-knit organization of 5 communities bonded by the traditions and local knowledge surrounding the indigenous potato. By preserving the species, the people of Potato Park hope to preserve their culture and traditions.
They're tied to this landscape in fundamental ways. It has a history, and they appreciate it in a way that we probably don't.
Because of their conscious connection to the land, they have successfully cultivated over 3,000 types of potatoes that have woven their way into the center of their culture. This is completed by supplying genetic data to the international gene banks and agricultural innovation for the purpose of research and preservation. These people have come together because they understand there is strength in numbers. By creating a bond between these areas, the culture is maintained. Parque de la Papa has evolved from a remote Andean highland community since its establishment in 1998 to now host hundreds of tourists each year. These visitors pay to enter and experience Potato Park's authentic culture and rich Quechua traditions. Members of the bioreserve also generate income from sales of beautiful textiles, indigenous medicinal creams, and native herbs. This now supplements their economic gains, as well as being an exceptional method of adapting to challenges this culture has faced.
Especially or fundamentally, I think the big question is, can you make a living? You know, if you can make a living, that all is good. If your traditions are based on a very specific lifestyle, if they're based on a very specific set of resources, and those resources are threatened in any way, then it becomes a major question as to whether you're going to be able to maintain it or not.
Small island communities in the Chesapeake, such as Deal Island, can utilize these methods and implement them in their own communities. Deal Island has a golden opportunity before it, the possibility to create its own supplemental income by embracing the installment of ecotourism and educational services. The skipjack is a cultural icon of the Chesapeake Bay, designed specifically for this shallow waterway. There has been a push recently for the educational services to birth shipwright apprentices by a nonprofit organization, the Coastal Heritage Alliance. Mike Vlahovic, founder and director of CHA, has fashioned a beautiful mission to preserve these ships and ultimately the waterman culture. CHA's primary focus will be to assist fishing families in passing on their heritage to new generations within their own communities and to the broader public audience.
You know, I want to see this boat go out and work again because I want to see the culture continue. So, I mean, in a way, I don't care that much about that. I don't care that much about the boat. You know, it's really what the boat can do. The boat for me is a tool. There's not too many people that have dedicated themselves to maintain that tool, and that's really what drives me now.
By exploring the waterways, tourists will have a better appreciation for the small island environment that these watermen interact with daily. In addition, by exposing them to the oysters in person, visitors may be able to establish an emotional attachment and will therefore be more likely to dedicate time and money to saving this keystone species. This approach has been taken on by some retired watermen in the Chesapeake Islands and is proving to be a relatively stable income. In addition to educating the community about oysters, education about the vessels utilized in the retrieval of this food source is equally, if not more, beneficial.
It's beneficial in certain ways that island communities have maintained their distinct cultures, but you have to wonder for how long that's going to be able to be maintained. I think eventually the islands that we know to be permanent will also wash away. What I wonder will remain is that culture, or will the culture also be gone? You know, because again, these islands are bastions of this isolated traditional culture, and that I think would be the greatest loss. Greater than the islands themselves would be the loss of the traditional communities that are on them, and the sort of way of working with the environment and this understanding of the environment that can't be replicated.
As we have uncovered, an island community is measured by its isolation and its natural resource dependency. But the size of these small islands cannot mask the greatness of the unique cultures harbored in these environments. But cultures do change. If the change is thrust upon them, that is truly the damage to their livelihood. It is an immeasurable loss to have these cultures wash away with the tides of time. As Dr. Seidel so eloquently stated,
it would be a tragic loss. I think for humanity, in a way, it's a loss when a culture is extinguished, when a language disappears, because it embodies so much intimate knowledge that's been built up over hundreds of generations, you know, knowledge of plants, knowledge of soils, knowledge of landscapes. And I think that if they lost their traditional lifestyle, that would inevitably go away.
Preservation can only occur from within. These watermen and native Andeans must desire to prolong the existence of their lifestyles. And we believe that in order to do so successfully, these small island communities must look to each other for help. Observe their history, see what they have done in the past to keep traditions alive, and mimic that in their own habitat. Observe their present actions and how they adapt to change. Finally, observe their hope for the future and admire their determination to encapsulate the essence of their most treasured aspect of these isolated island communities.
Stand. Recognize who it is. Kelly Dabrowski, Madhu Cornelius, Tori Allpaul, Trish Petty. I would like to highlight that that was an original score by Jocelyn Farrow, Washington College student. She came in the studio last night and really did a good job on the music. I thought that was fantastic. Before we jump into questions, which I have a lot, and I hope you have many, before we jump into that discussion, why don't we take a break? How about 10 minutes? Just kind of mingle, grab something to eat, and we'll start our discussions. Nice job, guys. Really nice job. During the panel discussion, we won't be mic'd such as this, so we'll just have to speak loudly and clearly. So I hope that those documentaries inspired some thought, some question. And what I'd like to do and create now is a thoughtful discussion, both around those documentaries, but not limited to them. I would like to be able to open up the Chesapeake Semester experience and program as well. Understanding we have friends and family of students here, community partners and faculty, everything's on the line, and these guys are good for it because they're getting graded and they have to respond. Before we get into our discussion, I'd like to introduce our panel. My name is Mike Hardesty, Assistant Director, Chesapeake Semester. Here we have Kate Libby. She is the Director of Education at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum. You might have recognized Kate. She's been on film today. Kate is a great partner with us, along with other colleagues at the Maritime Museum. Rob Ferloni couldn't join us today, and Pete Lesher. We really partner and lean on the Maritime Museum. They're a great cultural institution. They have access to a number of people in the community that we get a chance to meet with. And of course, they just have an abundance of records and files that we can thumb through and learn from. And they have a great campus right on the Miles River that we overnight on and take advantage of when we're on the road. We also have Professor Matt McCabe, Professor of Philosophy here at Washington College. He is the course coordinator for the Humanities course. As Dr. Seidel said, this is a 16-credit semester, but we still have to kind of stick to normal semester lines. Even though we integrate them as best we can, it's still comprised of a course dedicated to the humanities, a course dedicated to the natural sciences, social sciences, and then again this interdisciplinary course all around. We have Professor Martin Connaughton. I couldn't have done that one if I tried. Dr. Connaughton is professor of biology and has been with the program now for a couple of years. He's joined us in Peru, which was a lovely trip. I'm sure he could share with us all kinds of lovely stories. We won't do that now. And he is the course coordinator with the natural sciences, along with Dr. Doug Levin, our deputy director at the Center for Environment and Society. Doug has been with us for a number of years. He's been to Peru how many times now? Three. And I'm sure you've got plenty of stories too. And finally, Dr. Seidel, of course, he coordinates the social sciences and also co-coordinates the interdisciplinary piece of the Chesapeake Semester along with myself. And we will be drilling these guys all kinds of hard questions you guys get to watch. So I'm going to start it off. I'm curious with the Access group, we can use that, on your piece on the Menhaden fishery. Did you ever eat one? Did you ever taste it?
No. We tried ordering. We tried ordering the smallest amount, and it was like 500. And we figured that wasn't probably the greatest.
You were going to order 500.
That was the smallest amount. They sell them in bulk, apparently.
Yeah, so we could give them out at the forum or something.
I am curious. The impediments to managing the fishery were clear in the documentary by way of the uncertainty that has come out of the most recent stock assessment. Can you speak a little bit more about that uncertainty, why there is uncertainty, and what does that mean?
I guess first and foremost, it's fish, and it's really hard to count or even figure out the population of fish. So that's the first problem. No one really knows, since they are a migratory species, where they are or how many there are. So that's the first problem. I guess I was just going to say the second problem is that the assessment that they're doing right now, we're not going to have the data for until 2014. So until then, it'll be hard to assess what is going on.
There's also the collection of data isn't widespread enough now that there's only one processing plant located in the Virginia waters of the Chesapeake Bay, when there used to be facilities all up and down the East Coast that were collecting data from the entire population of the Menhaden. So since we're only getting data from a concentrated area, it's not representing the entire population as well as it used to, or as well as it used to be able to do that.
And despite that uncertainty, there was still a 20% reduction in harvest. How did that 20% happen with such uncertainty on the horizon?
A lot of that was based on localized depletion, which means that in the region of the Chesapeake Bay, near the mouth of the bay, that's where omega protein does the majority of their fishing. And so with that, since it's a migratory fish, a lot of it's up near Maine and Nova Scotia. Those are 3 or 4 year olds, sometimes up to 5 years old, and the younger ones that are 0 to 1 year old are in the mouth of the bay because that's where they spawn. So they saw this huge depletion in that area, so they decided, okay, well, they had this this threshold model, this fishery threshold model that they looked at that showed the mortality rate versus the spawning rate and where the line was for overfishing. And in 2008, they went over that line just a little bit. It's a small percentage. And so once they made this 20% reduction, well, first I'll say 2008, that's when it really sparked this Save the Menhaden, they're being overfished by tremendous amounts. And then they made this 20% reduction, and the whole threshold model goes down like this. And it looks like they've been overfishing for like 30 to 50 years. And so that is really a huge reason behind them making this reduction. But it's completely flawed the perception of the reality of the fishery, how many fish are actually out there, and what the practice of overfishing really is.
And I also think that part of it is publicly driven. There have been a lot of people up and down the East Coast saying that either watermen who say that they aren't catching as many as they used to, or people who enjoy more recreational activities that are saying that they used to see these huge schools of them, and everyone's wondering where they are. So regardless of whether NOAA and the Atlantic States Marine Fishery Commission had concrete evidence of overfishing, they were pushed into action, I think, by way of this 20% reduction in order to really find out whether this overfishing really is occurring or not. And I think that the 20% reduction was set at that percentage because it was a good number for being able to recognize whether it's ecologically impacted and to not impact the economy too much. So I think that's why that was done.
Another viewpoint on that, the 20% is the regulation that's in place now. There was talk from conservationists that they wanted 50% regulation, and the talk was from 0 to 50%. 20% kind of lies in the middle, so we're not really sure if that has anything to do with it. Well, maybe we should try and see what happens. Obviously, there's not enough research there, so I think it was an attempt to see what would happen with the 20%.
I have a really quick follow-up question, if you don't mind. I mean, these are great answers, and they pertain to the data and to the science, and I got a question that's totally unrelated to that. When we designed this program 5 years ago, we knew there were certain places we really wanted to go. Omega Protein was one of them. They would not answer our phone calls, let alone let us in the door. How the heck did you guys get in there?
Go ahead, Kelly.
Well, I called. I kind of went through the loopholes that I think you guys might have faced. I just went ahead and called the senior director of fishing operations. And so it took me a while to get back to him, or him to get back to me, and then I was in my apartment, I got a call from Houston, Texas, where their headquarters is, and I had like a 25-minute talk with the guy asking what I was doing this project for and why I wanted to go to the facility, because they've been in a lot of bad press lately, and people come in there with innocent or seemingly innocent intentions, and then they exploit them. So after explaining to them what we were doing and why we were doing it, and that we weren't using it to like give them a bad name, they were a lot more open.
I wish I'd had you make the call 5 years ago.
Maybe now. Next year.
What was the most interesting thing, still staying on the Access group, just what was the most interesting thing that came out of this exploration, this journey that you went on? Was it, and it doesn't have to be fact-based pertaining back to just curious in the production of a documentary.
I really thought it was really interesting that basically what we were just talking about is the uncertainty. All these figureheads, the data collectors, the scientists, the plan coordinator at the Atlantic States Marine Fishery Commission, they're all so uncertain. And it was kind of odd to see people that high in power not knowing exactly what's going on with the fishery that they're dealing with. And I think that's the reality of the issue, is that sometimes you just don't know everything. You can't find exact pinpoints of anything, and you kind of have to figure out ways to deal with that and to go around that, knowing that we need to save this species.
Please. Why do we have to save the Menhaden? I mean, so what? If Menhaden population goes away in the bay, who suffers?
This is the reason that the organization of CCA, the Coastal Conservation Association, is really fighting to save the Menhaden. Is because they're all fishermen, pretty much, that are after striped bass and bluefish, weakfish, like all kinds of fish that eat this Menhaden. They're after, and and the reason that they want to save it is because when it goes into the bay and it's about 0 to 1 years old, that's when it's the size that striped bass actually eat it. After that, after it's about a year old, it gets too big and they don't eat them anymore. So that's why they want to save them in the bay, because like we said in the documentary, the variety of fish that come from eating this Menhaden is huge. And when folks eat Atlantic salmon, like this really popular fish that people eat it for its omega-3s. Those omega-3s are coming from Menhaden. If they don't eat Menhaden, then the fish is kind of useless in that sense. You're not getting that same nutritional value. So the amount of nutritional value that comes from all these fishes eating fish like the Menhaden is really important.
Well, so one quick, easy follow-up question: how are the Menhaden being valued?
They're really not being considered, because that's why we wanted to ask people what they knew about them, because no one really knows about them. So they're more instrumentally valued to make this fish oil product. They're not really intrinsically valued. They're not intrinsically valued in the sense that there's no moral consideration for the fishery, because they're so abundant. There's so many that you just keep taking them. They're going to be there forever. The spawning capacity, I think one Menhaden lays about 250,000 eggs per year. Something crazy like that. Like they lay so many eggs that just take as many as you want. So they're cheap, you know, there's that instrumental value, they're really cheap, and they're really oily, and they can produce a lot of product like fish oil and fish meal. So that's how they're valued.
You guys are intimating that Menhaden is the only species that other parts of the ecosystem prey on. And the fact is that every 10 years, the North Atlantic Oscillation reduces the population naturally. But when the Menhaden population crashed, there was no problem with the rockfish population in the bay. How come?
Well, species over time, they are able to adapt.
Let me help you this. First of all, you can say, I don't know. Second thing to do is that what other fishery is there in the bay that the rockfish would have to move to, or would move to, because they can't find other things to eat?
Soft-shell or crabs.
Crab, right. So that is what happened. When the population crashed, the rockfish went over to the blue crab to help them out. So the ecosystem did survive. The question is, with Menhaden, what happens if that fishery collapses commercially? Who cares?
It's what fuels not only Reedville, I mean, it definitely fuels Reedville, but whoever's employed by Omega or is a fisherman or commercially harvest the fish will suffer. So economically, we'll suffer if we don't fish the Menhaden.
Satisfied?
I could keep going.
Okay, let's get one for the island group. One of the things that we've done over the course of the semester is you saw each of these groups had a word, like access and island, that they had to approach these questions with and figure out something to research. We have a couple of we actually have a fair number of word pairs that we use over the course of the semester that are designed as sort of mnemonic devices for us to think about questions to ask. One of them is the difference between science and belief, two sides of a coin. Another one is modern and traditional. So I'm curious, in your island research, is there, in terms of how people look at and relate to nature and the environment, did anything strike you about either one or both of those terms with regard to the folks in Parque de la Papa or on Deal Island or Smith or Tangier?
I can talk about it. So I know one thing that we had discussed, not necessarily later on in the semester, but during the first two journeys, we talked about the significance of the oysters being placed there for the oystermen to take them. So that's just one way to look at, it's like a traditional way that they see it, and it's also a belief system. But even with the modern methods of harvesting with the dredging, it's completely different than how it was in the past. So it's almost as if they need to change that view, because they can't keep, at least what we're talking about is they can't keep harvesting it at the rate that they are, because it's, what we discovered is that it's less than 1% of what the oyster population used to be. So it's just an interesting combination of their belief system and the science behind it.
And also in Parque de la Papa, they strongly believe in Pachamama, and that's like a central thing in the community, is to believe in the environment to provide what they need to survive. And I think that's why they are so productive in making cultivating the potatoes, because they know how to use the land efficiently and sustainably. But nowadays they have this bioreserve to cultivate over 3,000 different kinds of potatoes, and that's due because of environmental changes like climate change, global warming. So I think they still believe in the beliefs, but it's becoming clear that science is becoming more prominent, and that's why they are adapting to this bioreserve.
To go off of what Madhu was saying, I think when we were there, we asked one of the members of Parque de la Papa, are you seeing effects of climate change? And he said, without a doubt, yes, we are. And that's like another sidestep from belief that he didn't consider, he knew his beliefs from his past culture, but then he also took another step back, and then he thought about, well, it is climate change, and he kind of put aside his belief in that climate change is actually affecting them in a way that they are now starting to grow the potatoes at higher altitudes, and they only can go so far because they're on a mountain. So that was kind of a connection between beliefs and science nowadays.
And also, really quickly, it's interesting because when you're there, it really is like an isolated place. So you would kind of think that they wouldn't be into that science mentality. They would believe in what they learned throughout the years in oral history and the traditions. So it's really interesting that what Chris was saying, how quickly he said, oh yeah, it's climate change, no doubt about it, and that's what's causing them to have to adapt with the potatoes. But you wouldn't, when you're there, you wouldn't kind of think, oh, it is climate change. If you were living there, I guess, you wouldn't think of that. You would think, oh, some sort of God is doing this upon us because we're not doing something right. But they are believing in the science part of it.
I found the intersection of modern and traditional really interesting as we worked our way through this, not just on the science part, but also on the economy and way that they interact with their environment with the potato and the oyster, and how they kind of keep those traditional roots of looking at the environment and how they interact with it, where they're not taking as much and developing and trying to find newer, more efficient ways all the time. Sometimes it's just, this is how they've always done it, and they know that they can stay in harmony with their population and with their amount of harvest, and how that's worked really well for them. Despite their vulnerability to collapse, they haven't, and they're working through that.
How about, it got me thinking about economies and what these two cultures, these two islands produce. One of them produces oysters for consumption by people outside of the island. At the Parque de la Papa, what do they do with their potatoes? Do they sell their potatoes, or are their potatoes strictly for themselves? And does this represent a major difference between these two islands?
There's definitely a lot of internal consumption. I mean, when we were there eating meal, everything we ate was made out of potatoes or had something to do with potatoes. So there's a lot of that internally, but there's also interesting with Peru, where it goes so quickly from coast to mountains that they can transport the people on the coast, have the fish, higher up they have the potatoes, and in between there's other types of agriculture. So there's a lot of trade between the three. So they do go down closer to the coast as well.
You mentioned in the video that these islands could benefit from learning from one another. What do you think these two particular islands might be able to offer to one another? Is there anything you can imagine, any way they could help one another? And as a follow-up question, did you come across any other island cultures that you think might be able to provide something that might help these two cultures?
To start with the second one, I know that we had originally we planned on discussing Smith Island as our island comparison for the Chesapeake, but because it's so isolated, because you can only get there by boat, you can't just drive over a land bridge like we did in the field. Amy was like 25. But yeah, so it's just interesting how, and in the movie we had talked to Michelle and how she commented on the fact that if she was even more isolated than she is now, there wouldn't be any way that she would live on the island. So I don't want to answer this second.
In the documentary, we did talk about how they could learn from one another in terms of reunite. In Parque de la Papa, you have 5 communities working together, creating a strong front to counteract the problems that they're facing environmentally and perhaps even economically. And I think Deal Island, we see that the watermen are so independent from one another. They work alone, they don't really talk to one another in the pubs and whatnot. So I think if the watermen could learn how to work together and not, always fight for the last oyster in the bay, they may have a chance of, finding sustainable or efficient ways of saving the oysters.
I'd like to build on that. So that was a question you guys asked me in my interview. Wadey Murphy, former oysterman, now turned heritage tourism, said that during his working days, a waterman would have taken the last oyster in the bay. And so what is the balance between a working fishery and population sustainability and tradition sustainability? That is a question that I'd like to hear you guys respond to for the island group, but also for the Menhaden fishery, because I feel like that touches on it as well. I mean, do you think they take the last Menhaden in the bay? And if they did, what would happen to the traditional community? I mean, what's the balance there? What do you think would be the ideal balance?
I think at least for the oyster aspect, is that I think there needs to be a better relationship with the oyster and understand and value it more than just instrumentally, because there's no other way that they're going to care enough about it to not just take the last oyster. And if they did that, sure, it's going to help you out at the time being, because oh yeah, that means I got another bushel, so I'm better off than the next guy. But it's not going to help you out because you're going to lose your culture. There's no point, you're not going to be a waterman or an oysterman if there's no more oysters.
I think there's a fine line between looking at the nature of oysters and even the Menhaden, looking at them as intrinsic values and instrumental values. If you can't balance the two of them equally, if you kind of see them more as instrumental, then there's a sure way of the resources depleting, and that will, as a result, cause the traditions to disappear too.
I think Madhu hit it really with just balance. It's just somewhere in between all of this that watermen need to have more of a say in regulations, and they know they're not going to completely deplete a resource. Hopefully that is their survival. But if they don't have a say in it, then they've been working these waters for generations, and they know stuff that maybe the science doesn't necessarily say out loud, but then also the regulation has the science behind it that they need to also listen to.
I think that watermen also need to learn the biology of an oyster probably more. One of the things that we learned was that oyster bars naturally, when they grow in the rivers, they grow in the cut banks. They need faster moving water so that sediment doesn't settle on them, and also that they get more nutrients so they can grow quicker. And also, I think if they were to just have a better understanding of how they grow naturally, maybe they can leave certain areas to grow and then harvest, have a rotation between areas to which they can harvest from. And I think once they have a better understanding of that, they'll also have appreciate more. I don't know, I'm not speaking for them, but I don't know, maybe they'll have a better appreciation for naturally how they are, and that way maybe they won't say okay, I'm going to take the last oyster out of the bay.
Kind of following what she said, after interviewing a lot of the watermen, they've always said power dredging is the key to keep the oysters alive. And when you power dredge an oyster bar, you're leaving it completely flat. And a natural oyster bar, they pile up vertically into the water column, and that's how they can flourish more and get the nutrients. So I think if the watermen can understand that that's how how they could get more oysters by leaving them in their natural state for a few years or however long it takes. Then that way they won't have to keep dredging them to keep them alive or keep them producing.
You guys have made some good points about the watermen and their approach to things and the possible utility of science in providing information about how the oysters grow. What are either of those things, or are the culture and the decisions made by the watermen, or are the science, is that what's driving this whole thing, or is it economics? How do you think economics is going to play into that, your whole scenario of the watermen, whether they learn more science or not, and what decision they make about whether to over-harvest or not? Do you think that there's economic forces behind that?
There definitely is, because it's their livelihood, that's how they make their money, so that's why they're so adamant about, I'm going to get that last oyster because that's how I'm going to feed my family. So I think it has a really big impact on how they view it.
But reach beyond them. Where is this economic pressure coming from?
The high demand for consumption. People want to always have crabs or fish or whatever. So as long as there's demand for that, the watermen are going to have to keep trying to be able to,
And let me just come to your aid right there, because what Trish was talking about in terms of oyster restoration and creating those mounds and such, whoever talked about that with you guys, what they didn't divulge is that even though that science is known by the oyster restoration people, what happens when you create those environments, it's difficult for the fishermen to deploy their gear to harvest those oysters. So the watermen know the science, but they also know what makes the ground easy for them to harvest. So we've got to look at the middle ground between those two.
One of the phrases that I heard in the island presentation that caught my attention was the phrase immeasurable loss. Remember where you brought that up? I think it applies to both videos, actually. If the Menhaden become extinct, would it be an immeasurable loss? In what sense?
Are you asking the access group now?
And either can answer. And then, I mean, the island group can explain why it would be an immeasurable loss to lose the waterman culture or the Parque de la Pampa culture.
I don't think it's an immeasurable. Well, it's immeasurable, but you see it in what Doug was saying before. When there's a declining Menhaden population, the rockfish go to crabs. You see kind of chain of events that are like a cause and effect from the declining population. But it's different from the oyster in that it's a migratory fish, and I think that it's not under the same stress that the oyster is in that sense, just because it's so much volume going out, all along the Atlantic coast, and the oyster in the bay is just so concentrated, and it's right here. It's right at their doorstep. So I guys spoke about competition, economic forces. I think aquaculture is going to kind of take over for the oyster. I'm kind of talking about for you guys right now. The aquaculture for the oyster industry is probably going to take over when this waterman culture dies out. Not saying that I want it to die out, because it's a huge part of the culture of the region, but that is a huge force that we looked at earlier in the semester, that they're making millions of oysters every year, and so that you can't make aquaculture for Menhaden, but that economic force is definitely there for the oyster.
We talked briefly about how maybe the watermen could participate in this aquaculture program of physically putting oysters into the water and tying the ropes and letting them grow. And we wonder if that maybe will help them understand how important it is to keep the oysters going each season and not take as many as you can and leave nothing for the next season. It might bring a better understanding, because they just do it for the profit. I'm not saying all the time for the profit, but for the majority of the time they do it to make the money and but if they do that aquaculture program, maybe it will help have a better understanding between the people and the watermen themselves.
Would you draw a parallel between the aquaculture that we saw at, say, Ballard and the intensive potato cultivation, Parque de la Papa?
I just don't know if anyone else wants to answer. Go ahead. I think it's certainly an interesting correlation between the two because they're both cultivating the crop. But I do think that it's different in a way because like the potato isn't going to grow on its own in the way that they need it to. And for the oysters, I feel that there is potentially a way to have them just grown wild again. So I think it's different because they need to be more, the potato needs to be more intensively cared for than I think the oyster should have to be. But the issue is that with the bay not being as clean as it needs to be, I think it's just an issue of like where they are in their, like in the timeline of, losing my train of thought, but you know what I mean?
I think maybe with the bioreserve it could be similar to the aquaculture in that people are being more aware of what it takes to take care of a potato, to grow it, to make it edible or use it for other purposes. So I think in some ways it is similar, but it's not the same, kind of what Kelly was saying, because you do have a better understanding of how important that potato is to the culture in such an isolated area, but I don't know. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, as we move about the Chesapeake semester, we meet with a lot of different people. I think that's quite clear, but it's a different way of learning by interacting directly with the source, interacting directly with farmers, interacting directly with watermen, not reading case analysis in a class. It's a different kind of way of gleaning information. And I'm curious, in the process and development of your documentaries, how were those exchanges? Was that something that was good, bad? Did you find anybody making something up? How was that learning experience for you?
Well, I think one of my favorite parts about the documentary experience was when we were at Deal Island on the last night and having that personal exchange with some of the watermen there. Just because it was one of those settings where they weren't intimidated by you. They didn't think that you were out to get them and say, oh, well, you're doing it wrong and this is the way that you should be harvesting the oyster.
We were in a bar, by the way.
Yeah.
I promise there's nothing wrong on our part. It was just the right setting to get the right conversation.
But yeah, it was just, they were nice and open about it. And I think part of it is because we were students and we just wanted to learn.
I think that one of my favorite things about this whole Chesapeake semester has been like how my eyes have been opened to things that I would never have thought about before. So I think that like with controversial issues, especially in the environment, like there have been a number of times where we'll go, for example, with our project on Menhaden, we were at the Omega Protein facility and the director of fishing operations is giving this whole PowerPoint about how their company is doing all these things to be sustainable and all these sorts of things. And you're like, yeah, that all makes sense. You're agreeing with everything that he's saying. And then I think that this is what I'm trying to say is the semester's, what it's done is that I was like, well, now I'm not really sure because you want to believe people, especially when you think that they're doing the right thing and they're telling you that they're doing the right thing. But if there is an issue, someone has to be doing something, and it might not be all one party. But I think that that's one of my favorite things about this whole semester is how I feel like my thoughts have kind of matured, and not everyone is all great and doing the right thing all the time.
I hope you still believe us.
Yeah.
We're never wrong.
You make stuff up all the time.
I like that throughout the semester we've gotten to see different points of view of the same topics or the same issues and kind of make our own stand. It's really interesting because before this, I would always want to defend about something, and I could never really do it because I didn't have that knowledge. But now that, because I've done this program, I can say, well, this is what is going on, and this is how I think. You just have a better understanding of it because you're getting the first kind of exposure to what's going on in reality and what you could do to help out.
I think one of my favorite parts was when we were doing the Susquehanna paddle. A lot of people like to blame the Susquehanna as the main pollutant for the Chesapeake Bay, but when we were paddling, the water was crystal clear. So it was kind of like, well, they're just pointing fingers at someone because they don't know who else to blame. And they're blaming Pennsylvania. And when we were when we were leaving Smith Island, we came across a guy Smith Island's further down south in the bay, and we came across a guy who was saying that, well, yeah, it's all Susquehanna parts. But I remember, Doug would say, you never know who you're talking to. So that was one of my favorite parts, because I was like, yeah, you don't really know yet. You didn't go on Susquehanna and see how clear it was. So
I think we learned a lot from going to all these different points of view, and then we'd all get back on the bus and we'd be like, well, now who's right? Everyone's telling us something different. So we'd go through these discussions of kind of working through it and kind of coming up with not our own stand, but pulling together all the information we learned of points of view that when you're standing there in front of them, they sound like, oh, that makes total sense. We're all nodding and agreeing, and then you go to the next place and they disprove everything you just learned. So it's kind of that figuring out who's right, and not necessarily that it's all one person being right and one person being wrong, but that middle ground of figuring it all out and putting it all together.
Kind of going off what Tori was saying, it's really a valuable experience to have because it's really engaging in that way that you're finding these controversies that you're in one place and you can agree with everything someone says, and then the next spot, it's completely different. But it makes it real, it makes it, like you said, it's not a case study in a classroom. You're not just like, oh, what am I reading? You're there and you're in this world and you're a part of, this situation, and you're trying to learn what's right, what's wrong, and trying to be inquisitive along the way and really, dig deep and find the answers has been really, really valuable. It's been a lot of fun to do too, because we're going to all these people that are directly involved in the issues that we're facing in the Bay.
I believe our topic for our final projects kind of summed up the whole semester. Like my group was saying, with the issues that we face, obviously people are going to try to sell you their side. And it was kind of great to go to Omega and be almost greeted in a harsh manner at first. Like, why are you guys here? What are you doing? What do you want? And then once we said, oh, well, we don't really know anything, they were like, oh, well, let me tell you. And they were so welcoming. And they were like, we do all of these sustainable things, and the PowerPoint and then the tour, and we have nothing to hide. And it was a really great experience, but it just definitely showcases everything we've been talking about.
And it also really highlights the value of asking the right question and trying to get people to not, dilly-dally around what you're actually trying to ask, and going to the different stakeholders in the industry, the Menhaden one. We were able to see one side and then ask that side to the next one, and it kind of brings about what people actually think about what we're trying to study. So questions are a good thing.
Mike, should we open up to the floor? I'm sure some of the audiences may have questions that they'd like to ask.
Sure.
Anybody?
Besides the oysters and the Menhaden, can anyone speak to any of your other experiences, things that you've experienced studying? Talk to them, you know me. Yeah, I know you. Want to learn about fish and oysters?
In Journey 4, the most recent journey, we learned about farming. So we went to 2 dairy farms, one large scale and one smaller scale. And so I think that was one of the things about the biases and getting the right information from the right people. And so we learned about farming's impact on the Chesapeake Bay, as well as, I I guess what I'm trying to say is like that the Chesapeake Semester, because you're going to people who aren't like, you're not reading a paper written by someone who researched it. You're going to the person who's actually doing it. So like, you know that when you're talking to a woman who runs a dairy farm of 100 cows, that she is working and going to tell you stuff that's honest and true because it's dependent on her livelihood. So I think that that's an interesting thing about it. And that was one of my favorite parts. I like cows too, but I just think that it's a neat thing. And I like that we ended back in Chestertown, focusing on farming because it is, I mean, if you look around, farming is prevalent here, so I think that's important.
It's interesting because throughout all the journeys, there's specific themes to each one. There's like a history, a sense of history of a place, yeah, sense of place, regulations and resources. Peru, for each journey, we've focused on certain things that allow us to have a better understanding of the Chesapeake Bay as a whole and as, individually, companies. We went to, for the fourth journey, we went to the port of Baltimore, and we've learned about oh gosh, I should just stop. Communism, how do you say it? Consumerism, and just how big, how massive it is. You see these ships that are humongous, and you say, why do we need these? Why do we need tens of thousands of carrier units that have all of these things that we just don't really need? I think it's just for each journey we've focused on a lot of things, but also honed in on certain things that make it special. And that, it's really special.
Like Wendy was saying on our second journey, we studied the geology and the changing landscape of the Chesapeake Bay watershed, going from the mountains of West Virginia all the way to St. Island. And on our way, we took different sediment samples and kind of tracking the changes in the sediment, the soils, and seeing how it shifts from these dark, mafic, mountainous, really kind of gross looking sediments all the way to like really fine, beautiful sand, and that's coming all the way from the mountains to the beach. And just tracking that, going like this huge trip, was probably like one of my favorite parts of the semester, just because we kind of got a whole view of not just the fish, not just the crabs, just the land, where we are, getting beyond the sense of place and history. It was just a physical kind of realization. Okay, this is it. It's huge. It's this great expanse, and you look at it on a map. It's just a tiny little spot on the whole scale of North America, and but it really shows a lot about how quickly land can change from mountains to the beach and how distinct the differences are in the sediment.
I think one thing that I really enjoyed was taking a really close look at individual things. Like when we were in Susquehanna, we picked up a rock, looked at the bottom of it, saw the little teeny different organisms, and just by that we could tell the health of the waters there. And just little things like that all over the Bay Area that we've kind of begun to notice, and we can take and do that in other bodies of water is just really interesting, and I enjoyed that a lot.
We all say that we can't even drive down the road the same anymore. Everything is like, oh, that's because of this. And it's just one of those things you never thought of beforehand. And it didn't all just come from lectures. It came from sitting on the bus, and Doug would be like, oh, look, that's a mountain because of this, or whatever. And so you can't drive down the road or go to the beach and think of it the same way anymore. So it really transforms the way you look at everything.
Didn't one of you write a blog? Thanks for ruining the beach for me.
I'm from the state of Pennsylvania, and I'd like to know, do you have any thoughts as to what we can do with Susquehanna so it doesn't damage the Chesapeake?
I can try to answer this. We were in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which is when the mountains of the Appalachians really start, and that's why the water is so clear, because we can't really have agriculture on these slopes. And so Lancaster County is just south of Harrisburg, and that is where the majority of the pollution runoff from agriculture, nitrogen and phosphorus are going into the waterways, going into the Susquehanna. And so I don't know how you can take the blame away from Pennsylvania because there's so much coming in from Lancaster County, but I mean, in terms of regulation, they'd have to, put like 30-foot vegetative barriers around all their plots of, productive agricultural land. They have to, what do they call it, silt? Doug, the silt nets, the ones by the waterways, is that what they call it? Curtains. Curtains, that try to trap sediment from going directly into the water. Reusing chicken manure and using it. Well, that's where we went to a poultry farm too. We got to learn about the process and how to use all the manure that is produced by the chickens to fertilize their land. But they control the runoff either in retention ponds that are diluted with water. So either that or they reuse it on their land and they have these vegetative barriers, so it's not going right into the waterways. So if that kind of regulation is in place, then you can really start to see a difference, and maybe Pennsylvania will get it back up.
So, Grandma. I think some things that you can do are, they get repetitive when they say, like, don't use lawn fertilizer, but that does have a big impact. Even if you have a really small lawn, it does add up. And even, I know something that I learned myself was that Cascade dish detergent. It's really bad for the environment too, just because it does the same thing as lawn fertilizer. So if you change any products that you use every day that does get into our water system, even our sewage, it does make a big difference when you add it all up in the end.
I have no lawn. It's fertilizers. And I live on the Delaware.
Hi everyone. I was just curious, throughout all your travels, I'm sure it's hard to summarize like the culture of the Chesapeake in just a sentence or two, but is there any chance that you could try and maybe narrow it down to like a certain element of the culture of the Chesapeake Bay as a whole that you really enjoy? Is there a couple of sentences you could share with us that expresses those thoughts?
The skipjack. You're done.
So are there like, can you elaborate on that?
I think that's the most prominent aspect of the Chesapeake, just mainly because it's been around the longest. But just the fact that, for example, when we were at Deal Island working with the Catherine, which is a skipjack that was originally built in 1901, we were working with the Coastal Heritage Alliance in order to restore it. And it's really important in order to help preserve these cultures that you need to keep things like the skipjack around, because that's what they know and that's what they've done for all these years. And it was designed specifically for the Chesapeake because of the shallow waters where the average depth is only 21 feet. So it's simple things like that. And so that's what I always think of when I think of the Chesapeake.
You guys don't want to talk about boats if there's something else. I didn't even pay you to say that.
Full disclosure, Mark was working with them on the skip.
For me, I think it's the main culture, part of the culture that stood out the most was part of the history of, this contact period when, Europeans came to when the British came to Chesapeake, and just seeing how this... We are Europeans. Anyways.
He was being more specific.
Okay, fine. Just seeing how this whole society developed around this area that's so wild, and the nation's capital is here, and just so many towns, we want to start making towns, there's all this history of people really developing this area, and then when you go out west, it's just the land just opens up. So I don't know what specific part of the culture that I can really grasp, but it's hard to say. It's like the connectivity to the land that was kind of obscured by that period of, slash and burn, let's plant tobacco, let's, build towns, let's build everything, and keep cutting down trees. I don't want that to be the part that I take back in the semester as the culture, but just the connectivity, I guess, to the land, and it's such a big part of the country. Like it's hard to pinpoint one aspect. It's not big in terms of landmass, but in terms of the amount of history here and what has gone on in the region, it just makes it really kind of diverse in the cultural spectrum, I'd say. Yeah, that's great.
I think that one thing that I really took away from it was a need for collaboration. And I think that goes multiple ways. I think that watermen and scientists, people in education, states, Chesapeake Bay is comprised of 6 states, so we talked a lot about one state makes a change and the next one down doesn't. What is the point of doing that, I guess? So I think that people can learn from each other, like the island group talked about. And I think that if you really collaborate, because we all have the same goal, we all want a clean, healthy Chesapeake Bay, productive, and a good source of economic input. So I think that we all have the same goal, so it really doesn't make sense why we aren't working together. So I guess that's what I really like.
Tragedy of the commons. Anybody?
I would say kind of food as in general, where we get our food. We've eaten crabs, we've eaten oysters and a half shell. We've eaten so many different seafoods and just food in general by going to different restaurants and hearing about what people think about their community or their culture in that specific area of the Chesapeake Bay. So I think it's interesting to see how food becomes a big thing to the Chesapeake Bay and how important it is then to try to save the bay, because that's where most of our food, the seafood, comes from, and it just drives us more to want to save the bay and make it healthy again, so that we can continue to enjoy the luxury of eating these crabs or eating these oysters that we often get at restaurants, or even when we get them to serve at home.
So can I just pick up really quickly on something Kelly said and Madhu said? In your travels, in all of this circular navigation of the Chesapeake Bay, transects across it, did you meet anybody who told you they didn't care about the Chesapeake, or did you meet anybody who said, I really don't care about the health of the bay? Nope. Why do we have all these differing opinions then? What's going on?
I think a lot of it comes down to the individual, what you have to do, trying to make people change their daily routines. They say they want to help the bay, they say they want to do all these things, and then you try to get them to not put lawn fertilizer on, or to cut their drain pipe and put a rain barrel. They just don't do it. They don't want to change their daily routine. But it's not like they're against changing the health of the bay, or helping the health of the bay.
Go ahead. Going off of what Anna said really quickly, the change most of the time, actually pretty much all of the time, requires money to do so. That's a huge part of it. If we're going to tell someone, they need to implement, I don't know, the rain barrels, or vegetable gardens even, or ponds, so that they can clean up their water. That is going to take not only time away from what they normally do day to day, but also the money.
One thing that I was going to add was just the fact that it can't be an inconvenience to them in order for it to work. I think that's another big issue, is that if it's something that they have to do out of their way, like going off of what Anna said, that's why they don't do it, because it's, that means I have to do that. Well, it's far enough away that I'm not going to worry about the bay anymore, because I have more pressing issues right in front of me.
Kind of what she was saying too. Sorry. Kind of what she was saying is we've talked about how people who are directly affected by the bay and who are indirectly affected by the bay, those people either say, yes, we need to do something to save the bay, or no, it's too far away from where I am. If I'm 1,000 miles away from it, why should I worry about where my pollution goes, if it's going to go into the bay or not? So we've talked a great deal about how people think of if they're directly affected, then yes, they want to do it, they want to try to save it, they want to put these implements in practice, and but if they're not directly affected by it or it doesn't concern them particularly, who cares why the bay should be saved? Yeah.
Okay, so you guys don't even know it probably, but you have raised the nagging question of my field of ethical theory. You know what I'm going to ask? Kelly or Rebecca, who took my ethical theory class last year? Why be moral? Why? Because you have to sacrifice so much self-interest. Why would anyone want to follow some duty or value that's telling them to go against their own self-interests?
I think it's just human nature. People like to care as much as they don't want to, they do. And it's just going to happen.
So you're saying you've got that on one side and tragedy of the commons on the other?
Yeah.
Yin and yang?
Exactly. You have to strike a balance.
I think that also creates a general attitude of if I don't do something about it, someone else will. So it's really not my responsibility because there's someone out there that's doing it. Or vice versa, nobody's doing anything about it. Why should I do something? Go out of my way to, invest in a permeable surface driveway, rain barrels or something like that. Why would I spend my money to feel good about something that doesn't bring me any, anything,
Incentive.
no, not incentive, but like
Happiness?
any value, yeah, just any happiness in terms
Free word.
there's a cool word for it, I forget.
So how would you motivate the people of the Chesapeake region to start being moral, what would you do? Would you have any ideas? How would you get people to do what's right?
I think it's trying to make it like a cool thing. Trying to make it's kind of like a revolution. Like being environmental now is starting to be like a kind of a cool thing. People like to recycle. People making it into people's daily lives through media, through whatever you need to do is kind of the way we're going, and I think it's the kind of way that it's going to have to happen is putting it in your face.
Is that as sad as it sounds?
It is.
We have to make it popular.
I'm not saying it's wrong or bad, but it's a little bit sad. It's like we're all third graders and we've got to have the new toy that's on TV.
If you had to watch a video, you couldn't read our papers.
It's great marketing, though. Be moral because it's cool.
I also kind of think maybe having the younger generation really put an effort into becoming more sustainable and using effective means of saving solving the environmental problems that we are facing today, because we've heard so much from the older generation saying we haven't been able to do it. We've tried to say, okay, this in 50 years' time we want this to happen, and 40 years later nothing has happened. So I think if we can push the younger generation to continue the efforts of making the environment in which we live in and we survive by important, then it might spur on
anarchy. Or don't give up.
So just a little bit of brainwashing then. With the grade school.
Just a bit, yeah.
That's good. All right.
I have to ask, guys. And Alan, I'll come to you next. Why don't you go ahead?
Well, I'm Alan Davis, and my brother and I are grain and poultry farmers here in Kent County, and have been part of the program here for at least 4 years. And I'd like to applaud Washington College for the program, and you can see by the thoughts expressed by the students, they don't just look at where is the pollution coming from, they look at the culture and the way culture has evolved throughout the watershed, and hopefully how things are improving, because we feel like we've done a lot to improve agriculture, and I just think they do a super job at getting it out there. But I'm a little bit wondering here, because I'm not here usually as a farmer, on the nightly news, at a lot of bay meetings, we've got the targets on our back. And I'm not hearing any of that here. And I just wonder, maybe what the group felt when they went on farms. Were they impressed with practices that we're doing now, or they still think we're the culprit out there, or just what your thoughts are, and maybe about to the cultural side of it is how important a viable agricultural economy in Maryland is to the Bay, whereas a lot of times you hear about how effective in bad way, but we look at it as a little self-serving because I'm a farmer, but I like to think that we're a much better alternative in development, which would probably move in as the viability of agriculture slid off. So I don't want to say too much more, but I'm interested in what you have to say.
Yeah, I think that, especially when we visited your farm, I knew what I had expected hearing about, if you live on the Eastern Shore, poultry farming is huge, and it's a huge controversial issue. So I had an idea in mind when we were pulling up of what exactly we were going to be seeing. And I was actually pleasantly surprised. I read a blog about it actually, how everything that, from the chickens hitting the water thing so then the water doesn't run more nitrogen off, it's the littlest things were considered. And so I thought that was kind of relieving in a way. And I think that, people realize that chicken farming and poultry is a huge economic input into the Eastern Shore economy. So I think that it's not, people don't say, oh, we should just get rid of all of it, because we would all be, I think, worse off without it. But what I think is that people need to realize and have the experience of going out and seeing it firsthand, because I think that the media portrays things like poultry farming to be a certain way, and in some cases they are, but I think in some cases they aren't. And honestly, I would rather go to a poultry farm knowing that it polluted a little bit more than going to developed houses and apartments and stuff, just because I feel like you can't relate as much with, oh, people live here, so that's good, whereas you're looking at a chicken and saying, okay, well, that's food or fertilizer and stuff like that.
I think another thing too is we also learned to gain an appreciation of you guys, mostly because one of the equipment that we were staring at was $500,000. And the amount of money that you guys have come in, go out, it's pretty mind-blowing, the little details you have behind it. And also the fact that you do have these targets on your back from other people. And the fact that you guys are able to, you want to improve, and you are making the effort to improve. And I'm very happy and pleased with what I saw. But it does take money, and it does take time, and the effort that has been taken so far is really good.
Yeah, I'm grateful for farms like your farm, David's family farm, because with all that infrastructure and all that investment into this equipment to have this self-sustaining production of grain to feed the chickens, and just this kind of circular operation you have, there's so much infrastructure that you can't start a farm now at that scale from scratch. It has to be a generational thing, and without that, without keeping this family farm going, without 98% of the farms in, was it Maryland alone, or is it just in the U.S.? Yeah, 90% are family farm, because it takes so much to have that operation run and still be profitable. And I'm grateful for that aspect of that lifestyle, that you're producing food for so many people. And just what Trish was saying, you get a whole different outlook and appreciation for that industry that is so paraded. It's like people tear it apart because they think it's, they're polluting the bay. Like, that's why I mentioned your 30-foot retention, your vegetation barrier. That goes around your entire property. That to me was kind of inspiring, because you're taking this action to be environmentally friendly. And a lot of it's to do with regulation, but a lot of it is just because you want to. It's really cool. It's powerful stuff.
being an animal lover myself, I was really pleased how the chickens were taken care of. I've watched, there's a documentary called Food Inc., and it kind of portrays, I guess, the bad side of what poultry farms are like, caged birds in cramped spaces, pollution everywhere, this unsanitary system going on. And when I went to his farm, I was amazed by how happy the chickens were, how healthy they were. I know it's a small thing, but it makes me happy to know that some farmers take that extra step to not just think of the profit, but also think of how happy and healthy the chickens are or the cows are. I mean, we went to the dairy farms too, and it was the same case. They do care about these animals, whether they're being used for meat or for milk or whatnot. They do care about them, and it's nice to know that, because it completely backfired on what I was expecting when we were going to go and visit.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Does our panel have any final remarks? Thank you so much for coming tonight. Thank you, students. You guys have done a wonderful, wonderful job this evening. One of your comments, so I know who answered most. I graded it already. I also want to extend a thank you to our family members and friends who are supporting the students here tonight, because it took a lot of support to do this. In general, love extended from afar as we were in Peru, a lot of trust in our own program in Washington College, but really you made this happen. So I want to extend a thank you to you as well.